broadcast. Our normal events are obviously face-to-face and done in London, and our third virtual broadcast. How we're going to run today is Professor Kishore is going to be speaking for 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to move into Q&A, which I always find is the most interesting part. And you've got a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And so the questions should come up, and so then we can answer them in the end. We might try and kind of couple them together depending on how many come through. And for those who haven't joined ERC events before, we are an organisation that promotes the education of economics, trying to engage with the young broadly, which I once was. And so please join, become a member. We are a charity, and so we always welcome new members to join the ERC. Today, I'm very excited about this talk today. Professor Kishore, who's going to be speaking to us, and tiny kind of little bit of background about yourself, and then maybe you can expand on it. A veteran diplomat, study of philosophy, and also a celebrated author. I understand you've written 8 books. You have got articles in the New York Times, Financial Times, Washington Post, and Foreign Affairs. So which kind of, I suppose, has made you a kind of globally recognized authority on the Asian century that's coming up. Your latest book, which I noticed that you're very strategically placed, a little bit like John Cleese behind you, has China won? I think you should have had a few more, and I should have had some in the office. I know members of the ERC, some members have been giving out 20 copies or so of your books to members. Evaluates the two sides of China, which I'm really excited about hearing that today. So I don't want to go into too much, but I do know that the Times described it as a blistering analysis of America's fall from grace, which I think is a very interesting way of describing kind of what you've pulled together. So without much further ado, I'm going to hand the stage over to you and put myself onto mute, and then we'll come back in at the 30-minute marker to do Q&A, and then we'll be wrapped up in roughly 45 minutes, an hour. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that generous introduction. I'm very happy to join you today, and I wish I could be conveying good news to all of you. Unfortunately, I have more bad news than good news to convey, which is that clearly the major geopolitical contest that has broken out between the United States and China, and which is of course the subject of my book, Has China Won, is continuing to gain momentum. And the reason why it's gaining momentum, of course, is that it's driven by a deep structural forces. And I want to say that if you have any doubts at all about whether or not this contest will carry on, those doubts have been killed by COVID-19. And I say this because, there's a very old rule of geopolitics, which says that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So in World War II, when Churchill was fighting Hitler, the enemy of Hitler was Stalin. So Churchill and Stalin became good friends, and indeed wined and dined together because they had a common enemy who was Hitler. So today, as you know, the enemy of the United States is COVID-19, and another enemy of COVID-19 is China. So logically, since US and China share a common enemy, COVID-19, they should be coming together to fight COVID-19, and that would have been a rational response on the part of US and China. But what's amazing is that instead of doing the rational thing, they are doing the irrational thing, and which is they're actually stepping up their geopolitical contest when they are fighting a common adversary. And it's basically illogical behavior, but then it demonstrates also that the forces that are driving the US-China contest are quite fundamental. And I'm just going to mention 3. And we can, of course, explore them in greater detail when we come to Q&A. The first, of course, the first structural force that's driving this US-China geopolitical contest is a very predictable one. And it's been around for 2,000 years or so. So, for over 2,000 years, one of the oldest rules of geopolitics is that whenever the world's number one emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's number one power, which today is United States, the world's number one power always tries to push down the world's number one emerging power. And actually, there's a Harvard professor called Graham Allison, who's written a very good book, Destined for War, in which he documents that most of the time over the past 2,000 years, that's what happens. And it's a very rational response, because no country likes to go from being number one power to number two power, so they'll resist it as much as possible. So that's rational. But what's unusual about this US-China geopolitical contest is that it's also driven by an irrational dimension, which actually, frankly, no one talks about, partly because it's politically incorrect to speak about it. But I want to raise it because I mentioned earlier on, I gave you a hint that some of the behavior of the US and China is obviously irrational, illogical. Why is that happening? And the answer is that, of course, this contest is also being driven by deep emotional forces. And the emotional force that I bring out in the book and discuss is that there has lain buried for centuries in the Western psyche a fear of the yellow peril. And that's something that's real, it's there, it surfaces from time to time. It surfaces in Fu Manchu novels. And of course, in the case of the United States, at the end of the 19th century, of course, the United States Congress did pass something called the Chinese Racial Exclusion Act. So that emotional dimension is also a factor. And I think if you want to understand why some of the actions taken by the United States, and to some extent actually self-damaging, why is that happening? It's because this contest is being driven by emotional forces too. And the third structural force that also explains the tenacity of the US-China geopolitical contest is the fact that there was a very widely held expectation in the United States that as the United States engaged China, United States would open up China's economy. And after China opened up China's economy, China's political system would open up. And after China's political system opens up, China becomes a liberal democracy, and then the United States and China can live happily ever after. Now, this may sound like a fairy tale, but actually, several very leading Americans' minds have actually confirmed that was the American expectation. In fact, Kurt Campbell was an Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, has actually published an article in the magazine Foreign Affairs saying this, and for some of you who may have read the recent book by John Bolton, he also confirms that was the expectation. Now, this expectation is important to emphasize because what's unusual about the US-China geopolitical contest is that when in the US today, whatever President Trump does, the Democrats oppose him. It's almost automatic. Whatever Trump does is by definition bad. Yet when Trump launches trade war against China, launches technology war against China, the Democrats said, we are right behind you and we are completely behind you. So it's in fact the only policy that Trump has, which is bipartisan. And why is it bipartisan? Because the Democrats and Republicans shared that same expectation that China would become like the United States. It hasn't happened, so there's disappointment. But yeah, I just want to mention in passing that future historians will be very sort of puzzled by this American expectation, because the United States, at the end of the day, is a very young republic of less than 250 years old. And it's interesting that this young republic, which is less than 250 years old, with 1/4 the population of China, believed that when it engaged China, United States would transform China, rather than China, which is a 4,000-year-old civilization with its own political culture, its own political tradition, that China would transform the United States. Well, that reflects a certain degree of arrogance in the American mind, but that was this expectation. So what's happened, therefore, as a result of these structural forces, the US-China geopolitical contest has gained momentum, and so even gained momentum, as I said earlier, despite COVID-19. But what is puzzling about the US behavior in this US-China geopolitical contest is that even though the United States has launched this contest against China, there's no doubt whatsoever, the actions speak loudly, the United States actually hasn't worked out a comprehensive long-term strategy on how to manage China. And here I must say that the man who gave me this insight was Henry Kissinger. You know, when I was doing research for my book 2 years ago, I took a 1 year sabbatical in 2018. And during my sabbatical, I spent 2 months in New York and had a one-on-one lunch with Henry Kissinger, a wonderful lunch. And after the lunch, I was trying to figure out what's the big message that Henry Kissinger was trying to convey to me. And it was very clear that the big message he's trying to convey to me was that US has launched this contest without working out a comprehensive long-term strategy. So I got his permission to cite him in my book. But it's not just Kissinger who would have this insight. I think anybody who's a serious strategic thinker would come to the conclusion too. And here, and the way to demonstrate this is to compare what the United States is doing vis-a-vis China with what it did when it launched this geopolitical contest against the Soviet Union in the late 1940s. And at that time, one of the leading geopolitical thinkers in America is a very famous name called George Kennan. And Kennan gave very wise advice to the United States when it embarked on this contest against the Soviet Union. Of course, he advocated a containment policy, but he later said he was misunderstood in his advocacy of the containment policy. But even so, even when he was advocating containment of Soviet Union, George Kennan gave some very valuable pieces of advice. You know, for example, the first piece of advice he gave is that the outcome of the contest with the Soviet Union at the end of the day would depend not on who's got the larger military, not on the number of bullets and bombs that countries have. You see, at the end of the day, the outcome of the contest between the United States and Soviet Union will be determined by which society is more vibrant, more dynamic, and the words he used was which society would have greater spiritual vitality. And at the end of the day, he was proven right, of course. You know, remember Khrushchev famously saying the Soviet Union will bypass the United States. It never happened. The United States always remained the more dynamic and more vibrant society. So if Kennan were alive today, he would actually be quite shocked by the United States embarking on this geopolitical contest against China, because he would say, first let's look at our own society. And the United States, which of course, as you know, has been the most successful society since human history began, has happened to have had 30 bad years because it's the only major developed society where the average income at the bottom 50% has gone down over a 30-year period. And you know, the net result of all that is that as two Princeton University economists have documented, Case and Deaton, there's a sea of despair among the white working classes, and that's what led to the election of Donald Trump. And I think it's, you know, you don't have to be a genius to figure out that the United States is a deeply troubled society domestically. Black Lives Matter, whatever it is, and lots of fundamental problems at home. And George Kennan will say, hey, are we taking care of our own situation first before we launch this contest against China? And if Kennan were alive today and if he saw what China has accomplished in the last 30 years, if the United States has been sliding downwards, the Chinese people have just experienced the greatest improvement ever in their standard of living. In fact, the past 40 years since Deng Xiaoping launched his 4 modernizations in 1979, 1980, the past 40 years have been the best 40 years in China's 4,000-year history in terms of economic and social development of its people. So you have, in a sense, two societies going in the opposite direction, United States declining, China doing very well. And Cannon would say, hey, let's fix our own situation first before we take on China. And then the second piece of advice that George Kennan gave was, cultivate friends and allies. It's very critical. And I think it's fair to say that the Trump administration has not been cultivating friends and allies. And what's even stranger is that if China is your number one geopolitical competitor, your two most critical allies are the immediate neighbors of China, namely Japan and South Korea. And here the United States has got military forces in Japan and South Korea that are supposed to help project a forward US presence in East Asia. And what does the Trump administration do? Try to charge Japan and Korea more for hosting US forces in Japan and South Korea. And you can imagine the sense of disillusionment that some of the Japanese and South Koreans may feel about what the United States is doing there. So again, alienating of friends and allies is not something that Kennan would advise. And the third piece of advice that George Kennan gave, he said, don't insult the Soviet Union. At the end of the day, we still have to work with the Soviet Union on some matters. And if you insult people, they won't talk to you, they won't work with you. And unfortunately, the Trump administration has ignored that advice, and you can see insults of China coming day after day after day. Very unwise, as George Kennan would say. And the final piece of advice that George Kennan gave, by the way, is that this very critical. He said, be modest, be humble. And I think that's modesty and humility don't fit the Trump administration. I say this because if the United States is serious about this geopolitical contest against China, it's obviously going about it in the wrong way. And that's a large part of the problem. But having said that, I want to emphasize that in any geopolitical contest, it is not the case that one side is right, the other side is wrong. In any geopolitical contest, both sides make mistakes, and China has also made some serious mistakes in the way it's handled the United States. And clearly, in my book, I say that the single biggest strategic mistake that China made was to alienate the American business community. And that actually was a very important constituency for China, because in previous times, back in the mid-1990s, when President Bill Clinton wanted to restrict Chinese access to United States, the business community immediately stood up and said, hey, don't fool around with the world's largest market. Please don't upset us. And so the business community would always apply the brakes whenever the United States wanted to take on China. But what's interesting is that when President Trump launched his trade war against China in 2017, 2018, the business community kept absolutely quiet and didn't say a word. And so China had made a serious mistake in alienating them, partly by, allegations of stealing of intellectual property, forced technology transfer, and also, frankly, the Chinese became somewhat arrogant after the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. They thought the United States was on the ropes, China was strong, and therefore the arrogance of the Chinese came out, and for which they paid a price. So clearly, both sides have made mistakes. So here we are in the middle of the geopolitical contest. And so the next obvious question to ask, the obvious one is, who's going to win?
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that the United States, the reason why I chose the title as China Won is behind that title is the question, can America lose? And what's amazing is that the United States cannot conceive of the possibility of losing. It's impossible. United States always wins. And it's true. I mean, for the past 100 years, the United States has won every major contest. World War I, World War II, the economic contest against Japan, the Cold War against Soviet Union. So the United States assumed that he's going to win always. And so if you ask the Americans, why are you so confident in the win? They say, well, a dynamic democracy always defeats a sort of sclerotic communist party system. And I don't disagree with that premise. A dynamic democracy can defeat a sclerotic communist party system. But then you see, is that what the contest is today? So what my book tries to do is to dig deeper And you mentioned the quote from the Times, where I try and dig deeper and look at the deeper strengths of American society and Chinese society, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to determine the outcome of the contest between United States and China. And in the case of China, in the case of United States, to start United States first, it was a dynamic society, a dynamic democracy. We had a government of the people, by the people, for the people. But as you know, as Martin Wolf of the Financial Times also agrees, and has said so in his column several times, United States, which used to be a democracy, has become a plutocracy. And you know, as he says, it's a government of the people, for the rich, by the rich. So the consequence of that is that, and this is something that my book goes deep into, it explains how the American political system can be hijacked by money. And because it can be hijacked by money, everything, the whole system is designed to ensure that the rich get the larger share of the increase in national income. And as you know, United States has had this dramatic increase in inequality, and actually it's very unwise of the very rich to do that, because they now have a very disgruntled working class, and that creates all the social problems and tensions that you see in the United States. And by the way, I want to say that some very serious people, I don't necessarily agree with the assessment. I want to tell you what they say. They say that given the rising levels of tensions within the United States may be in a pre-revolutionary moment. And this is, I think, this is what would trouble George Kennan if you're alive today. How can a society that is so domestically troubled take on such a major geopolitical contest against the world's oldest civilization? It seems unwise. So that's on the American side, the challenge that the United States face. And in the case of China, which is supposed to be run by a sclerotic, rigid, dictatorial communist party system, what's amazing is that China has created the world's largest meritocracy, which means that it picks the best people to work in government, to serve government. And so as a result of that, the level of competence of the Chinese government in many areas is far superior to the competence of the American government. And this is simply a case of selecting the best people, which is what, by the way, great universities do, which is what the great consulting firms do. You always pick the best people to work with you. And I realize how this is something that is very little known. Most people think that a communist party is not something people aspire to join. Why would you want to join a communist party? Great, are you crazy or something? But when I was in New York again for my sabbatical, Columbia University very generously offered me a research assistant who was a master's student, a young lady from China. And one day I was chatting with her and I said, "What was your life like? Tell me what was life like in China?" She said, "Well, when I graduated from high school, I graduated number 2, and I was very sad." So I was very puzzled. I said, "Gosh, if I graduated number 2 from my high school, I'd be very happy. Why were you very sad?" She said, "Because in China, only the number 1 gets selected to join the Chinese Communist Party. I couldn't fulfill my dream." So can you imagine, I don't know how many thousands of high schools there are in China, and among them, the best are aspiring to be number 1 so they can join the Chinese Communist Party. So the quality of mind of the Chinese Communist Party is amazing. And I can tell you, just a few days ago, last week, someone sent to me a report produced by the Harvard Kennedy School Ash Center. If you have any doubts about the resilience and strength of the Chinese Communist Party, read that report. It just came out in July. And it points out how remarkable the Chinese Communist Party has become, and how, because it's able to deliver the goods and take care of the people, it has an amazing level of support among the Chinese people. And so when, recently when Mike Pompeo said, "Oh, we are opposed to the Chinese Communist Party. We love the Chinese people. We want to rescue the Chinese people from the Chinese Communist Party," which of course is the traditional Western believe. Everybody, all people naturally want to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party. But the evidence will show that Chinese people love the Communist Party. and it's a reality. And in the Harvard Kennedy School Society, Kennedy School proves that, study proves that. And also, by the way, there's an Edelman Trust Barometer study, which I actually participated in the launch with, sitting in this chair from Singapore a few months ago. The government that enjoys the highest level of trust among its people today by far is China. It's the 90% of the people trust the government, not surprisingly, because of the competence and delivery. So the reason I say this is that when you have the black and white conception, which is what the Americans have of this contest, we are good, they are bad, we are dynamic and competent, they are rotting and incompetent. That's not born by reality. So in that sense, my book at the end of the day is meant to be a gift to the United States, to tell the United States, why don't you think harder before you take on this massive contest? Think about the possibility that you can lose. It's something inconceivable, right? So that's what I hope, that there'll be deeper discussion of the relative strengths and weaknesses of the two sides. And I have some other examples in my book also. But I conclude by just making two additional points. The first, of course, is that and this is a point that George Kennan made, is that at the end of the day, this contest will be decided in part by the strengths of the United States versus China. But if there are 1.4 billion people in China and 330 million people in the United States, that still leaves 6 billion people outside the United States and China. And I think if you poll the 6 billion people today, especially after COVID-19, the 6 billion people, by and large, don't want to get involved in this US-China geopolitical contest. They have more important things to do, and they're not enthusiastically rushing to join either side. And I would say, with a possible exception of the current government in Australia, most of the other countries have been very cautious and very careful about taking sides in this geopolitical contest, because countries have other things to do. And in fact, if you took a poll of countries, they could send a message. The one message they would send to both Washington, D.C. and Beijing is, please, let's take care of COVID-19. Let's restart the global economy. Let's make sure that global poverty doesn't grow. Let's focus on the important things, and let's press the pause button on this geopolitical contest. And that, I think, is a key factor at the end of the day that will also influence the outcome of this US-China geopolitical contest. Because unlike the first Cold War, where lots of countries enthusiastically supported the United States, that's not happening at this time. So my final point is to conclude, in a sense, by asking, is it conceivable that we can persuade the US and China not just to press the temporary pause button of the US-China geopolitical contest, but actually try to work out a new deal, a new arrangement with each other? And that's how I conclude my book, by pointing out that I speak about a term that is rarely used, actually, in English, the 5 non-contradictions between the United States and China. And I'll just mention 2. So the first non-contradiction is that if the primary goal of the United States is to improve the well-being of its people, and frankly, given the troubled condition in the United States, the primary goal of the US government should be to take care of its own people first. And then if the primary goal of China is to improve the well-being of its people, and that's clearly the primary goal of the Chinese government, then frankly, they can achieve their primary goals of improving the well-being without going at loggerheads with each other. In fact, if they work together, and indeed, frankly, even today, if President Trump genuinely wants to give a boost to the markets and give a boost to global confidence, all he has to do is announce, okay, I will stop the trade war, withdraw all tariffs, let life go back to normal till COVID-19 is over. Can you imagine the impact on the markets? They'll say, wow, the trade war is halted. Good, let's come together, fight COVID-19, So just common sense would say that's what they should be doing. So that's one non-contradiction. The other non-contradiction is that increasingly we live in a world where the biggest challenges that we face are global in nature. And if you had any doubts about that, COVID-19 has erased all doubts. COVID-19, we may have started in Wuhan, in China, but you can see how quickly it spread around the world and just, and now the whole world is shut down because of a virus. And no one country can fight the virus alone. As I say in a previous book, The Great Convergence, I say that the big fundamental difference about our world today is even in the past, when 7.5 billion people lived in 193 separate countries, it was as though they were living in 93 separate boats with captains and crews taking care of each boat and rules to make sure that the boats didn't collide. But today, as a result of the world shrinking and coming together, the 7.5 billion people no longer live in 193 separate boats. They literally live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. But the problem about our global boat that we live on is that we have captains and crews taking care of each cabin and no captains and crews taking care of the global boat as a whole. And this gives a competitive advantage to the virus, because the virus says it doesn't matter if you clean your cabins, I'm taking over the ship. So you need to have clearly greater cooperation in global, there won't be a global government, but you need greater cooperation in global governance to take care of these common challenges. That also applies to global warming also. And just to conclude with that, in the last page of my book, I say that if the United States and China keep fighting while global warming is growing, the future historians will look at them and compare them to two tribes of apes that were fighting each other while the forest around them was burning. Now, we would look at those apes and we would think they're very stupid, but that's what we are doing today. So let me pause here and take your questions.
Thank you. That's absolutely kind of fascinating and a really interesting kind of lens that you're putting on. We've got quite a few questions coming in. And just to remind our guests that at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A, and hopefully you can type a question and then pop it in. We'll get to them as soon as we can. And so while guests are doing that, I have a kind of a very quick question. Is it feels like there's an inevitability that China will overtake the US. In what time frame do you perceive that to be? Because I look at it from a military angle and from an expenditure, saying, China has 2 aircraft carriers where America has 20. China has 4,000 aircraft where America has 12,000. America's budget on military spending is 600 billion a year, where China is 200 billion a year. That seems like a vast gap to close down. And so at what time frame do you think that America will perceive China to be a really strategic threat?
Well, I'm really glad you raised the military budget because number one, the key point is that when you say when will China overtake the United States, to go back to the Kennan's point, the key factor here will be which country has the larger gross national product, GNP, larger economy. And, as you know, these projections, it all depends on what you factor to be the growth rate. But I would say even if the United States keeps going at 2%, which is possible, and China grows at 6 to 7%, and, by the rule of 72, they would double their GNP in 12 years, right? So it's a matter of time. And actually, it doesn't matter whether it happens in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, it's going to happen.
So your view is over the next 12 years that we might...
Yeah, so China is going to have a larger GNP. Now, the next question, which is an interesting one, is that when China has the larger GNP, will China be happier or unhappy if the United States keeps spending more on defense? And the answer to the question may surprise you. I actually discussed that at great length in my book, which is that America's defense spending is a gift to China because it's diverting resources into non-productive areas and in ways that do not threaten China. Now, I'm glad you mentioned aircraft carriers, because in 1996, when there was actually some tension between the United States and China, President Clinton wanted to send a warning to China against firing missiles across the Taiwan Straits. He sent 2 aircraft carriers, and he threatened to send them shoot them through Taiwan Straits. In the end, he decided not to do so, not to be too provocative, but he still sent 2 aircraft carriers, and the Chinese discovered how defenseless they were. But today, if there's a crisis in the Taiwan Straits, I guarantee you that United States will not send 2 aircraft carriers into the Taiwan Straits, because as a Harvard professor, Tim Colton, told me the Chinese had developed hypersonic, superfast missiles that will make these aircraft carriers complete sitting ducks. They become sitting ducks. And I actually, at a lunch in Singapore, I sat next to a lady who was worked with the Pentagon for many years, and she said, "Kishore, we have done our war gaming in all these scenarios now, and our Navy now has to stay very far away from China. We cannot win. We are now outgunned already." So even though the American defense budget is much bigger, it is not an asset of the United States. And in fact, in my book, I have a chapter called "Can America Make U-Turns?" The most sensible thing the United States should do immediately is to cut its defense budget by half, because that's not where the contest is going to be, and invest that money in R&D. But of course, the United States has had a tradition of having brilliant defense secretaries, but the brilliant defense secretaries cannot cut the budget, because the budget, once again, is controlled by congressional lobbies, where there's a piece of the pie is given to everybody, and the budget cannot be cut. And the fact that the budget cannot be cut is a competitive advantage for China.
Okay, so we have to. I'm sorry, everybody, for hogging that first question, and we've got a lot of questions coming in, so we're going to have to tighten down the answers. So I always find the Q&A the most well, partly not the most interesting, but a very interesting part of any talk. So there's a question that come in terms of today's international travel and the familiarity with other kind of cultures across the world. Is that not bringing people together? And I guess the changes in communication, internet, does that not change the geopolitical game?
Well, I hope it does. Okay, I'll try and give you very brief answers. As you know, when COVID-19 happened, all of us were locked up at home. And I've been sitting in this chair talking in Zoom meetings for 4 months now. But the curious thing is that so they said this is creating deglobalization. In some ways, of course, it is creating deglobalization because we can't travel, planes cannot fly. But actually, just by sitting in this chair, I have, in some ways, traveled more across the world. I'll give you one example. One evening from 8:48 to 8:45 p.m., around now, I spoke to Chatham House in London from 8:45 p.m. to 9:45 p.m. Singapore time. I spoke to the Confederation of Indian Industry in New Delhi, and then from 9:45 p.m. to 11 p.m., I participated in the Yale University President's Council. So in 3 hours, I traveled across 3 continents, And so I think that I'm not unique. I'm sure it's happening to lots of people also. So I hope that if COVID-19, because it's a common challenge, and if the response to COVID-19 is greater participation in the digital universe actually connects us faster than any other universe does. So I hope it does have a positive impact in reducing the intensity of the US-China geopolitical contest. Okay,
interesting. So this great, very interesting question. Looking forward to getting your view on this. So if there was a democratic China, do you think it would be more domineering on the international stage or less?
Well, I mentioned Graham Allison in his book Destined for War. In one of his comments, he says, Americans should be careful what they wish for. He said Americans keep saying, "Why can't China be like us?" And Graham Allison said, "Wait, stop. Do you realize what America was like when it emerged as a great power around 1900, when Teddy Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy? The first thing he did was to launch a war against Spain and then take over the territories of Philippines, Guam, and other places. And then, they intervene in internal affairs of various countries. So that's how a great power behaves. It exercises more military muscle. And in response to your question, I have absolutely no doubt that if China became a democracy, and if China had a democratically elected leader, the democratically elected leader would be far more nationalist than the current Communist Party government of China. And actually, I do think that the Communist Party of China is delivering a global public good by restraining the Chinese nationalism, which is growing, by the way. It is a growing force. And you have to have the power of the Chinese Communist Party to try and restrain that force.
Amazing. I'm going to, this diametrically opposed question here, which is, you say that the Chinese people love the Communist Party. How do you know that? Because everybody in Nazi Germany loved the Nazi Party, or the Russian Communist Party. Everybody loved the Russian Communist Party when it was fully kind of a political force. What evidence have you got that they do?
Yeah, well, those are wonderful analogies, and I would say if China is like Hitler's Germany, if China is like Stalin's Soviet Union, China's going to fail. And if China's going to fail, relax, sit back, have fun, do nothing. It's going to fail, right? Simple. But I'll take a bet with you. Take a bet with any of you. 10 years from now, the Chinese Communist Party will be much more powerful, much stronger, and continue to enjoy the support of its people as it continues to deliver the goods of its people. And by the way, the 30-year track record of the Chinese Communist Party in the last 30 years in improving the livelihood of Chinese people is one that has not been matched by any Chinese government ever in Chinese history.
I'll put £10 on that.
Okay.
That's true or not.
Thank you.
Because there's the other, of course, view is that China is a hugely authoritarian government that controls freedom of speech. WeChat is the predominant use for transferring of funds, and if you're in disagreement with the government, your WeChat accounts disappear, and so that makes it very hard to oppose the current regime. But I think enough said on that topic. Is China likely to offhold large US holdings of treasuries? That can be a quick yes or no answer.
Well, you see, it depends on how much China is pushed, by the United States. Right now, the Chinese government still wants to play by the 1945 rules-based order. And as much as possible, China is trying to not escalate the contest with the United States. It will react in kind. So if you close a consulate, I close a consulate, they'll do that. But it will not step up the contest against the United States. So it won't take an unnecessary. But at the same time, I think in my book, the one unusual idea I plant, which is complicated, is that in this contest between United States and China, if the United States has an Achilles heel, that Achilles heel is the reliance of the United States on the US dollar as the global reserve currency. And any basic economics will tell you that if you have the world's global reserve currency, you can live beyond your means, as the French president said, that it's an exorbitant privilege. So if the Chinese export products to the United States, the Chinese workers have to work very hard to produce Apple components, the United States can print money and pay for the Apple components. So it's a great deal for the United States. But if the United States has been weaponizing the US dollar, as we all know, and that's why even UK, France, and Germany have set up instex to bypass trade and trade with Iran, but it's not going to work. But never mind. But the fact that countries are trying to move away from the global reserve currency may create a real problem for the United States. So actually, if the United States continues to try to weaponize the US dollar, it's creating incentives for countries to move away from the US dollar. And if that happens, then I think the US economy could literally get a major shock.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. strange, strange kind of tangent of questioning. Vietnam, should that have taught the US something, and what was it?
Well, the remarkable story about Vietnam, I think future historians will be very puzzled by this. If I'm not mistaken, the biggest recent war that the United States has fought, actually it's not Iraq, it's Vietnam, because it lost more soldiers there, and it was a much more painful war. And it's sort of paradoxical that Vietnam as a country, please double check this, has received more American bombs than any other country has, by the way, you know. Vietnam has been bombed by America more than any other country has. And the paradox here is that the best friend of America today in Southeast Asia is Vietnam. I want to mention that because what is puzzling about the United States, when it deals with countries, it doesn't look into history at all. You know? It doesn't look into historical perspective. And I can tell you one of the things I can say, I guess with some pride, is that in 1985, when Vietnam was still a major adversary of the United States, and when Vietnam was an ally of the Soviet Union, I gave a talk at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York in 1985. And the title of my talk was, Why the US Naval Base Will Eventually Move in Vietnam.
Oh, can you say that last bit again? I don't know, I lost you there.
Why the US Naval Base will eventually move from Subic Bay in the Philippines to Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam. So in 1985, 35 years ago, I predicted, and I was proven right, by the way, you know, the US naval vessels are no longer in Subic Bay, and US naval vessels are calling on Cam Ranh Bay.
Huh.
And the reason for that is that for Vietnam, the #1 strategic challenge will always be China. So Vietnam will look for ways and means of balancing China, and that's why it goes close to the United States.
So the lesson that America learned?
So the lesson they should learn from Vietnam War is study history.
We have got 9 minutes left, and we like to keep strict timetable for all our members and listeners. So we're gonna have to keep. We've got lots of questions coming in, so we're gonna move swiftly on. There's some really new exciting. We haven't spoken about Huawei and the relation. You know, the UK's kind of U-turn on Huawei, really following the influence of the US on this matter. Does the UK matter to China? And is our position going to be weaker, worse as a result of Brexit? So you've got Huawei there and kind of Brexit, I suppose, combined into one.
Yeah. Okay, very, very quickly. In January this year, I can't give you the name, obviously, but a senior influential British person told me in Davos, I asked him, so will you will you accept Huawei 5G? He said, of course. He says, GCHQ has scrubbed Huawei. We are inside Huawei. We have scrubbed their software. We know what they're doing. They're no threat to us. I said, surely Washington, D.C. will call you and say, don't put Huawei. And the senior British person replied to me, Kishore, the US needs the UK as much as UK needs the US. We'll proceed with Huawei. That was in January. July, boom.
Yeah.
So,
what did Trump say?
To me, frankly, that was
one of
the biggest events of 2020 is seeing how a very senior British figure can assure me that UK will never cave in. And then the UK caved in. But this is a reality. This is what geopolitics is about anyway. And of course, this is a difference between the first Cold War and now. Remember, against the Soviet Union, British were more enthusiastic in fighting the Soviet Union in some ways than the Americans were. Now it's not the same. And on Brexit, I fear that Brexit was clearly going to diminish UK's standing in the world. I mean, I'm sorry to say this, okay, but there's some. In geopolitics, it's very important not to be sentimental. It's important to be hard-headed and realistic. And of course, I may be proven wrong that UK may actually standing may go up in the world, but frankly, on its own, the UK will drift down towards becoming more like a middle power. And you know, if the population of UK is what, 60, 70 million?
66 million, I think.
You know, there are so many more countries today. Vietnam is close to 100 million, you know. Okay, so Vietnam, I'll tell you, frankly, is really going to become a remarkable country with the new Japan that is coming.
Huh.
And can you imagine, UK was here, Vietnam is here. 50 years from now, Vietnam will be here.
Well, let's see about that. Well, I'm definitely going to try and make sure that doesn't happen. Investing in UK businesses. The ideologies between China and America, is that gap just too big? I mean, you speak of a lovely utopia where let's solve global problems, but can we realistically ever think that the two can really coexist together in the global stage?
Well, I think they can. And in fact, the third non-contradiction that I have in my book is that there's no contradiction between the two ideologies. And the reason why Chinese ideology doesn't contradict American ideology in the way that Soviet ideology contradicts American ideology is that the Soviet Union exported its ideology. So it was a zero-sum game. If a country adopted Soviet ideology, it then became an enemy of America, right? So It was a zero-sum game. Whereas in the case of China is not exporting communism to anybody. After Deng Xiaoping came to Singapore in 1978, Lee Kuan Yew told him, if you export communism, we cannot be your friend. So they've stopped exporting communism for over 40 years. And guess what? The number one trading partners of China, many of them are US allies, not Chinese allies. So there's no contradiction there. And I think ideology is not a force at all. What the Chinese, and this is a key point I haven't emphasized here, the key goal of the Chinese leaders is not to revive Chinese communism. The key goal of the Chinese leaders is to revive Chinese civilization.
Yeah.
Chinese civilization is not a contradiction with American civilization.
So therefore, there is potentially, in your view, a kind of coexistence. Is your next book going to be Could India Win? I mean, it's a huge, vibrant economy, population, demographic, expansing, a kind of global territory. 20th century, you had US versus Russia. Surely it ought to be 21st century India versus China. Can they get their act together?
I'm ethnically Indian, and I would definitely be happy if India succeeds and does well. But I think, speaking very candidly, India doesn't have the same degree of strategic discipline, both externally and internally, that China does. I mean, eventually India will get there. But it'll take a much longer time. And I agree with you that if you are having this conversation, I would say 30 to 40 years from now, I won't be around. 30 to 40 years from now, the main contest will again be between the world's number one power, which then would be China, and the world's number one emerging power, which would then be India. And the United States can sit back and watch it.
Okay, we've got a load more questions, but I'm going to stop with three. So we've got to try and squeeze these ones in. Europe, the EU, should the EU play a role in this battle, in this contest? And if we should, what should that be?
The answer is yes. I discuss it in my book. The big solution for most of our global problems is greater multilateralism. The European Union is the best living example of multilateralism. The European Union should lead the world in strengthening global multilateral institutions, like the World Health Organization.
That's really a brilliant perspective. Okay, what's the next steps China will do to increase its kind of economics power? And kind of rolling into that, I suppose, is China's long-term global objectives beyond domestic economic growth. So how will China demonstrate its kind of winning values, kind of that you mentioned, the kind of spiritual vitality or kind of vibrancy, for example?
Well, the Chinese have no desire to export Chinese civilization to the rest of the world. You know,
Whereas
the Chinese
America
are
does.
actually very,
Yeah.
are very puzzled that the Americans believe that the whole world, and the Americans believe this, that the whole world, if they became like Americans, the world would be a happier place. And Americans may be right in that, but they certainly believe that anybody can become an American. The Chinese believe only the Chinese can be Chinese. And if you're not Chinese, that's fine. We'll work with you, but we don't expect you to become Chinese. And they certainly don't expect me to become Chinese at all, you know. So they're quite happy to have their own civilization. They're happy to work with the rest of the world, but they don't expect to convert the rest of the world. In fact, they believe in a philosophy of live and let live and accept the diversity of the world. And the Chinese are actually very comfortable with the multipolar, multi-civilizational world, which is, as you know, the exact opposite of the American vision, which is that everybody should become like us.
Yeah. Well, look, that is spot on. We're now running 2 seconds over. Thank you, Professor. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you on behalf of the Economics Research Council and all of those who've joined today. If you haven't had a chance to see, or those who joined a little bit late, the Professor has China One book behind his head. So do go out there on Amazon and buy it. And do please become a member of the ERC, because we need you to continue doing fascinating talks like this. I think a lot of people are signing off now, so thank you, and we might stay a tiny bit longer. We don't necessarily need. If you've got to run off right now.